Welcome to week 6, and I congratulate you on making it this far in the course. We're now over halfway through, and I'm very pleased with the work that you all are putting in. I have a few administrative comments, one to answer a question, and then to talk a little bit more about the discussions. And then I'll move into our wrap-up of week 5 and introduce week 6. So one question I had was with regard to the number of comparative assignments that are due throughout the quarter. So there are the weekly comparative assignments. Again, these are the 500-word comparative assignments based on primarily hidden riches, but there's also a few that I've created outside of that, which are more iconographic in nature, and you have another one coming up here pretty soon. But yeah, so you do 7 of those. I changed that from the original 8. So you do 7 of those throughout the quarter. Now, and these are between weeks 1 through 9. You choose which weeks you don't turn in those comparative assignments. And so again, if you have a midterm this week or some big project, whatever the case is, you can choose this week not to turn it in. You just need to make sure you do 7 total between weeks 1 through 9. Then at the end of week 10, you have a 5-page comparative paper that is due. And this is, for the most part, very, very similar to the 500-word comparative assignments you have been completing, except that it's longer, and you choose the texts or images to which you compare a biblical text. And I want your proposal to me by the end of the week so I can give you some feedback. Again, let me know which texts, which A&E text you want to compare to which biblical text, or which iconography you want to compare to the biblical text. And I've given you a list of resources, many of them freely available electronically, that you can access and choose suitable texts to compare to biblical texts. And so what I want to do, based on the proposals you provide me, is give you a little bit of feedback. And so kind of tell me why you want to compare the texts, what you hope to get out of it, what you think at this point, just based on your cursory look at the texts, where you think your project might go. And I might give you some feedback like, hey, these are great texts, but maybe not the most suitable or most profitable comparisons. Maybe maybe I'll suggest other texts or another direction that you could go. But this gives you a few weeks to get some feedback, and then also, if you're not on the right track, to find better texts to use for that paper. Otherwise, with regard to the discussions, the reason that I extended the deadline to Monday was to provide you all with that kind of little bit of a breather at the end of the week. So in case you take a true Sabbath during the week, which some students do, or you're busy doing ministry or whatever the case is on Sunday, that you're not crammed, you're not rushed to get those posts in by Sunday night. However, one trend that I don't want to see happen, and I've kind of seen it this week, is everybody delaying now till Monday. The goal is that the posts are up Thursday, the discussion begins on Friday. So you have Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday with which to have a profitable, meaningful discussion. If everybody waits until Monday to post their posts, that's not gonna be effective, and I'll either make the deadline back on Sunday, or implement something else in order to get the discussion to be extended over those couple days. So please do that for me. Now let me talk about week 5. So we've kind of reached a threshold with regard to our time periods that we're looking at. Again, the first 2 weeks were focused on the fourth and third millennia. The next few weeks were focused on the second millennia. And now we've crossed this threshold between weeks 5 and 6. We've now moved into the first millennium. The week 5 focused on the kind of end of an era, the end of the second millennium, but really more the end of a particular historical period in the ancient Near East. Around 1200 BC, the ancient Near East collapsed. And this was due to a number of things. And the best term for it is synchronous failure, meaning a number of different aspects of ancient Near Eastern culture and society and civilization changed or collapsed. There was a lot of immigration happening for a number of reasons. There was climate change and drought. There was war and invasion. a group kind of collectively called the Sea Peoples, migrated from kind of Western Mediterranean areas into places like Egypt or Ugarit or the Levant. In fact, this is where we get the Philistines from, one of these groups that came over in these waves of migrants that kind of invaded the ancient Near East, or the Mediterranean and Levantine areas. And these are depicted and described in Egyptian artwork and in Egyptian texts, how the Egyptians battled against these Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples destroyed or were part of the cause for the collapse of the ancient city of Ugarit, which is where some of the texts that you read last week originated. There was economic collapse, collapse of trade during this time period. And there was also a general withdrawal or a collapse of the great powers. The Hittite Empire collapsed during this period, and for a number of reasons. The Babylonians and the Assyrians experienced the migration of the Arameans, and so their power was focused inward in protecting their states. Egypt, again, didn't collapse, but its hegemony over the Canaan and the Levant weakened, and they've lost that control over those areas. They would soon regain it, but at least for a small period of time, they lost that. And this is primarily, again, due because of the invasion of the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians had to focus inward on protecting their closest borders, their immediate borders. And so we have the synchronous failure of the ancient Near Eastern socio-economic and political system, which led to a number of things. One, it led to a vacuum in the area of Canaan, or the Levant. And this led to the development of these Levantine states, such as Phoenicia, Philistia, Israel, Judah, Edom, Moab, Ammon. All of these very, very small Canaanite states developed because of this vacuum and the freedom and flexibility they had to emerge from under Egyptian hegemony. Previously, it had just been a conglomerate of strong states led by small rulers a conglomerate of cities led by strong city rulers. And what happened is, as Egyptian strength and power and hegemony faded, this created a vacuum for the development of these small polities. And so we have, in this period from about 1200 to about 1000, the development and differentiation of new languages. So a number of dialects of Canaanite developed, so Hebrew, Moabite, Ammonite, Phoenician. Writing systems developed around this time. We had ethnic, religious, and political differentiation. And we see these cities kind of grow into small city-states. And this is where we find the ethnogenesis of what we now call ancient Israel. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but as we move into the first millennium, this is where we find figures such as Saul and David. One of the big issues of this past week, so week 5, was the concept of Baal. And one of the questions that need to be addressed is it one or many deities? And in fact, it's both. So the Baal could also be a term for a deity, not necessarily the deity's name. So in Hosea 2:6, Yahweh says through the prophet Hosea, "No longer will you call me Baali, my Baal, my Lord. From now on, you'll call me Ishi, my husband." And so it does appear that these Israelites, for some period of time, called Yahweh Baal. So it was just simply a term to address a deity. It's also a very specific deity. So from the text from Ugarit, we see that Baal has a distinct personality, in contrast to Mot, the god of death, Yam, the god of the sea, and El, the Canaanite high god. And then the third kind of aspect of this is we find a number of local manifestations of Baal. And so local personalities of a deity called Baal. This is very similar to the way in which we have local manifestations of Yahweh. So there are a number of inscriptions that speak of a Yahweh of Teman, or a Yahweh of what's the term? Yahweh of Teman and Yahweh of Samaria. Sorry for that small lapse. And so we even have local manifestations of Yahweh, local personifications of Yahweh. And we get a number of different pictures based on who is writing about Baal. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal is spoken of very amicably. He's actually a friendly deity who fights on behalf of or intercedes on behalf of very specific individuals like Kirta and Akkad. From the Israelite texts, we see a kind of Baal spoken in pejorative terms. He's someone who contrasts with and is worshipped alongside of Yahweh, who claims exclusive right of worship among the Israelites and the Judeans. And the question that I pose to several of you in the context of the discussions is, how would an ancient Israelite have distinguished who was the true God based on the information and evidence that he had? And this idea that one would strictly devote themselves to a single deity and deny the worship or existence of other deities is really a unique thing in the ancient Near East. We saw a little bit about this in the Amarnid period with Akhenaten, getting rid of the cults of other deities and worshiping only Aten, the sun disk, the sun god. We find something similar in the Babylonian creation narrative, Enuma Elish. It's not quite exactly the same, but we do find a focus on Marduk as the supreme deity, and these other deities being kind of manifestations of Marduk. And then in Isaiah and the prophets, we do find a move from monolatry, which is the exclusive worship of a god while not denying the other deities that other deities exist, into, and really this happens after the exile, an exclusiveness and a true monotheism. So the denial that other gods exist and the exclusive worship and belief in one God. So consider that as you kind of reflect on week 5. Now let me move into then week 6, and we're going to introduce the first millennium. So we move into this new period, and this is the period of Israel's ethnogenesis, the creation of their ethnic state and identity. And consider that Judges, the book of Judges, is likely a more historically accurate account of Israel's ethnogenesis than, let's say, the book of Joshua, which presents kind of a conquest model. We'll talk about this a little further. Saul and David appear to be more like warlords as we look closely at the books of Samuel and Kings. Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it might be shocking to some of you to know that there's very, very little historical evidence for Saul, David, and Solomon. In fact, there's not a single inscription from all that we possess mentioning Saul, David, or Solomon. The closest we get is the Tel Dan Stela, which is a piece of stone inscribed in Aramaic after the conquest of areas in northern Israel by the Arameans, and they reference the house of David, the Beit David, and so this is several hundred years after the time period that David, or really about 100 or so years after the time period that David would have existed. Now it does provide us some historical information with regard to a tradition or a legacy, a royal legacy from someone named David. But it's not an exact reference to a specific person named David. There's no mention of anybody named Solomon outside of the biblical text either. The first reference we get to the Israelites is in a stela, in a text called the Merneptah Stela, which dates to around 1207 BC, and this is a victory stela commemorating the victories of Pharaoh Merneptah, which is a late 13th century pharaoh. And it talks about Israel being defeated by Merneptah, but Israel is spoken of as a person or a people group rather than a geographic entity or an ethnic identity. It's not a location, it is a people group. And it's in and around Canaan. It fits among a number of Canaanite locations that Merneptah claims to have conquered. So this is a very interesting and important text for placing the emergence of Israel in the historical record. I also have you reading a couple texts from the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Deborah and the Song of the Sea. These are probably the earliest poems based on a number of archaic features in the language of the texts that we find in the Hebrew Bible. And what's interesting about these texts, in addition to other what we would call archaic texts such as Deuteronomy 33 and Habakkuk 3, that we find this tradition of Yahweh not being originally a Canaanite deity, but actually having come from the south. And so as you read the Song of Deborah, you'll see places like Seir and Edom and Sinai and things like that that are mentioned. And I recommend you reading Deuteronomy 32 and Habakkuk 3. You'll see that Yahweh is depicted as a war deity who came from south of Canaan. Again, he's not originally a Canaanite deity. Think about the fact that he reveals himself to Moses on a place in Sinai, a place called Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, depending on the tradition in the Bible that you're reading. Moses' father is a priest, apparently of Yahweh, who's a Midianite. And then we have records from Egypt that referencing a people called the Shasu, who are from a place named after a deity named Yahu, likely Yahweh. And so Yahweh is a southern a deity from south of Canaan that was transported into Canaan by some people group, likely, possibly the Shasu or Israelites who maybe did exit from Egypt. And so, again, this helps us to understand where Yahweh fits into the biblical text, and also why there was likely some challenge between Yahweh and Baal. Baal is a true Canaanite deity. Yahweh was moved into Canaan. And this brings up the issues of the Israelites' ethnogenesis. How did they come about? And there are multiple models. The two that you're most likely familiar with, particularly the first one, is the conquest model. And this really simply reads the book of Joshua as it is, from a prima facie perspective, and says the Israelites exited Egypt, they conquered Canaan, they destroyed cities, and they moved into the area. There's a lot of issues with that, particularly when you date the Exodus, the number of Israelites you consider exiting Egypt, and then also some historical issues, archaeological issues with places that are depicted in the book of Joshua as being destroyed, like Jericho and Ai, not having been populated during the time that we would place the Exodus. And so there's some problems with that. Another model, which is a kind of sociological model, is the peasant revolt model. And this is advocated by scholars such as G.E. Mendenhall and Norman K. Gottwald. And they were influenced by kind of Marxist ideas of kind of a lower class rising up against an upper class and then overthrowing that upper class and taking over. And there are some interesting aspects to this, and some of it seems to align with some of the biblical data. But this is the peasant revolt model. Another model is really a kind of a complex model, and this has been offered by scholars such as Avraham Faust, who's an archaeologist. And really what we're looking at is likely a mixed multitude. And so, and then really the biblical text provides information about this as well. Even the Exodus narrative says that a mixed multitude left Egypt. We have prophetic accusations of your mother was a Hittite and your father was an Aramean. Even Abraham was not a Canaanite. He moved from Mesopotamia. And so we have this idea of a mixed multitude, and probably or possibly multiple exoduses, small groups leaving Egypt over time. Some, even Canaanites, became part of the Israelite people and ethnicity. We have a number of foreign elements from east of the Jordan or south from Midian in other places, conglomerating in the Judean highlands, which is where we find the earliest archaeological evidence for people that we would call the Israelites, and then emerging, having their own ethnic identity in the context of this vacuum of Egypt's withdrawal from Canaan, and the emergence of a number of socio-political groups, such as the Philistines and the Phoenicians and the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites. And so we have this emergence of a particular people group in the Judean highlands, which emerge in order from an effort to distinguish themselves from the Philistines. So what the Philistines do, they don't circumcise. The Israelites circumcise. The Philistines eat pork. The Israelites don't eat pork. And we also find a number of some archaeological evidence of distinction in the types of houses that the Israelites built, in the lack of trade because of purity issues, or likely because of purity concerns, the lack of trade in things like pottery. And so if you're interested in this, again, look at Avraham Faust's book on Israel's ethnogenesis. And again, so there's three models: the conquest model, the peasant revolt model, and then this really complex model which looks at Israel's emergence in terms of conflict with the Philistines and a mixed multitude coming together and creating an ethnic identity, creating a cultural memory for themselves, which then, through time, it becomes the basis for what we have in the Old Testament, which is why we have a number of divergent voices in a number of the texts in the Old Testament. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. I look forward to this week's discussion and your engagement. And if you have any further questions, please let me know.